Welcome to Stout for Christ, a radio ministry of Stout Memorial United Methodist Church in Parkersburg, West Virginia, with our host, Sarah Sisson.
I'm Sarah Sisson, host of Stout for Christ, and we're glad you're listening to our radio show today. Stout for Christ is a ministry of Stout Memorial United Methodist Church located at 3329 Broad Street in Parkersburg, West Virginia. We invite you to become a member of our Stout Church family. We offer 2 worship services each Sunday, a contemporary worship service at 8:45 and a traditional worship just following this broadcast at 10:45. If you can't join us in person, our services are broadcast live on Facebook and YouTube. Stout for Christ is a ministry meant to help us navigate life and learn more about God's love for all people. Today our topic is a look at Timothy, and here to help us learn more about this subject is Pastor Helen Oates. Welcome, Helen.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you. It's good to be here, and it's a way for us to be able to follow up on the conversation of last Sunday. Because last Sunday we talked about relationships, just how important relationships are for us to be able to invite people, be able to encourage people to be a part of the life of the church. Relationships with those whom we normally would not associate with, most likely. But developing relationships, and that takes time. But I wanted us to be able today then to take a picture out of Scripture of 2 people who were in a mentoring relationship, and that's Paul and then Timothy, because we see what Paul is doing through 1st and 2nd Timothy as he tries to guide this very young pastor. Timothy most likely was, just in his late teens as he was being set apart for a particular kind of ministry, and Paul wanted to make sure that Timothy had a good foundation, and so mentored Timothy. Even many times when Paul was in prison, that he would send letters back and forth to Timothy to keep him encouraged. But one of the things that Paul wrote in 2 Timothy is something that we need to remember ourselves. Paul wrote, "I'm grateful to God, whom I serve with a good conscience, as my ancestors did. I constantly remember you in my prayers day and night. When I remember your tears, I long to see you so that I can be filled with happiness. I'm reminded of your authentic faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. I'm sure that this faith is also inside you. Because of this, I'm reminding you to receive God's gift that is in you through the laying on of my hands. God didn't give us a spirit that is timid, but one that is powerful, loving, and self-control." And I know when my kids would venture off, whether it was to college or to a new employment, or often the words that I would say to them, remember who you are. Remember where you came from. Remember. And this is what Paul is doing for Timothy.
Yeah, he's having him, look at his grandmother and mother and see how they're living their lives, and hoping he will remember where he came from and what he learned from them. Yeah, and
saying to him, they were women of faith that you can model their lives as a way to help you with your life. Paul and Timothy shared a similar passion that was to be able to be followers of Jesus. And, Timothy would see the life of his grandmother and his mother. I am reminded, when we talk about grandmothers, I'm reminded of my own grandmother. She was a little short woman. She could swing an axe and cut wood like any man, we might say. But she was one who taught me about death, because I watched her dealing with the death of family members. She was there when a grandson, Ronald, died as a 12-year-old with a tragic accident on the farm. And to see her, I remember her at his casket and how she came and then sat next to me because she knew that I knew Ronald as well. I saw her as she would lay to the grave her sons who had been a part of World War II and were forever different because of that. I saw her be able to say goodbye to my grandfather, her spouse. I saw her work hard, but also saw her work within the life of the church. I have a little tiny hand sewn apron that had a pocket sewn on the front of it. And Grandma and the other women of the church made these little aprons as a way to help people, encourage people to give money to the church to be able to complete the building of it. And I just think about those efforts to help. She wasn't a loud singing or speaking up individual, but those subtle ways in which she lived out faith and encouraged others in their giving. It might only be a coin that fit in that little pocket, but it was something in addition to be able to use for the new church building. So, those things are we end up modeling what that means. We end up modeling that kind of generosity, or we end up modeling when we see justice and love lived out. And that's what Paul also says to Timothy. Remember your grandmother, remember your mother, and later on he says, even remember me, talking about himself as his mentor.
It's important to remember where you came from, and it's important to, especially in your faith, remember those who helped shape your faith.
Yeah, and we can recall maybe Sunday school teachers or maybe youth leaders who were a part of the church, and those times and those experiences were important to us, and it does help to shape our faith. And so Timothy, as a faithful young pastor, he was inexperienced. And so in 1st and 2nd Timothy, and if you haven't read those letters for a while, I encourage you to go to the Bible and to read them again, just to remember the words that Paul shared in First Timothy to talk about the congregation, and then in 2 Timothy to talk about Timothy's character, the kind of character that he needed. But so they are in this relationship of a mentor and a mentee. And how important that is for us to be able to walk alongside someone, to be able to be their mentor, so that they will find themselves growing in faith and growing in a spiritual depth. We think about trees, and oftentimes when there are big storms, we will see a tree uprooted. And it's just amazing to see the roots on that tree, to see how long and wide and deep and twisted, and just the root system of a tree. God wants us to help develop the root systems of our mentees, of those that we want to mentor, to help develop those systems, that root system, to be able to help the tree stand strong. I know I read about the great redwoods in California, and it amazed me to hear that in their rootage system, the roots don't really go down that deep to hold those trees, but what it does is it interconnects with the other tree next to it. So it's all of these interconnecting parts that help those trees stand firm. And that's a good image for us as church, as a community of believers. It takes us to interconnect with one another in order to keep all of us standing, we might say. But as Paul talked to and led Timothy, we hear him give Timothy some practical advice.
I was going to say, it sounds like he had some roots of his own trying to help Timothy, build that congregation that needed to be strong, right?
Yeah, it was. And, those things that he taught Timothy was, to remember who you are, remember that root system. And he also said, don't be ashamed of your testimony. Oftentimes we think, my testimony is not that great. I haven't been blinded by a big light like Paul, or I haven't been knocked off of a horse. But our testimony, our way of being able to tell our story of how God touched our lives and began to lead us in a more faithful way of living and being. Our own testimonies are so important. Maybe it's the story of when we were violently sick and we got through that, and how we felt during it. Maybe it's a testimony of we've heard people saying that they needed $1,000 to get something accomplished, and then suddenly there's in their mailbox a couple letters with extra money in them, but we need to be able to share those stories that have meant so much to us, and it is in the sharing that makes the difference. And he also said, we pass along that message of Jesus, and also the piece about suffering, because it is important for us to be a people of prayer and to invite the congregation to be in prayer for him. He went on to say, speak, instruct, and act correctly. We have a list of expectations that are part of who we are as United Methodist pastors. And I know not only in our denomination, but many other denominations would have similar moral kind of expectations. And yet we can remember the Jerry Falwells or the who was the woman that had the big black eyes shadow, Tammy Faye Baker. I mean, we can remember these persons that we thought, they're just not really too showy and didn't seem to be authentic in their faith. And so, that's what Paul is saying to Timothy, you have to be authentic in your faith. You speak, you instruct others, and you act correctly. And he also said to him, now don't delve into debates. Don't try to debate your opponents. Don't try to bring about, that sense of, well, I just want to be the devil's advocate. The devil does well in and of himself. We don't have to be his advocate. But because trying to debate with your opponents doesn't produce anything. And I think in our time, people are learning that, whether it's debating against Republicans and Democrats or those who are for the Earth's resources versus solar and wind and other kinds of resources that help to power us as a country. We can get into debates that causes so much opposition and very little good. And so that's what we don't debate for debate's sake, was the information that Paul gave Timothy.
Debates are definitely easy to come by these days and hard to avoid, but definitely something to keep in mind in today's climate for sure.
It is. And in when we go into 2 Timothy and we hear then the kinds of character pieces that he wanted Timothy to watch for. And I'm quoting this from chapter 3 of 2 Timothy. Paul says to him, you will be confronted by people who are selfish and love money, the kinds of people who brag and who are proud, who slander others and neglect their parents. They will be ungrateful, unholy, unloving, contrary, and critical. They will be without self-control and brutal, and they won't love what is good. They will be people who are disloyal, reckless, and conceited. They will love pleasure instead of loving God, and they will look like they are religious, but deny God's power. Avoid people like this. And
Pretty powerful.
Pretty powerful, yes. Yeah. And also pretty damning of religious people and the way in which we can come across. And, I've been in ministry for over 45 years, and I know pretty well what church people are like. And for Paul to be able to give this kind of picture of what Timothy's young congregation might look like. It was a way of being able to help guide him as a young pastor to not to get overwhelmed by those folks who want to pay a visit on you the first day you move into a new appointment. That there's always a story behind that, and people want to get in and see that their agenda gets put into the mind of the new pastor. But these are words that Paul shares to help Timothy grow and to help him be aware of the stuff that happens in the life of a congregation. Paul was being a mentor to Timothy. And often, we hear there were times when Timothy would journey with Paul to certain places, or Paul would write to certain churches saying, welcome Timothy. He's been a hard worker in the church. Help him along. It's this kind of mentoring, this type of giving to another. time and encouragement and guidance that when we want to disciple people, to disciple others, that we need to take up that mantle of being a mentor to others.
Words to live by. Well, thank you, Helen. That was a great discussion, and I know that there's someone listening today whose life is touched by your wise words of hope in Christ and love for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
If you were blessed by this program today and want to know more about how you can become part of the Stout Memorial United Methodist family, tune in to Stout Memorial's Facebook Live worship broadcast just after this program at 10:45 a.m. Send an email to stoutmemorial@gmail.com or attend a worship service in person at 8:45 and 10:45 each Sunday morning. This has been Stout for Christ, a radio ministry of Stout Memorial United Methodist Church, Parkersburg, West Virginia.